Australia's 2026-27 federal budget was sold as care and opportunity, but strip away the press release language and a different story emerges. While the government announces record hospital funding and aged care packages, the same budget locks in a projected $37.8 billion reduction to NDIS growth, stripping support from roughly 160,000 disabled Australians, even as the Australian Medical Association warns of a chronic multi-billion-dollar hospital funding shortfall. This same year, the AFR Rich List revealed Australia's 200 wealthiest individuals now hold a record $707 billion, with billionaires alone gaining tens of billions in a single 12-month stretch. This investigation lays out the budget documents, actuary projections, and wealth data side by side to ask a simple question. When the government says there isn't enough money, for whom exactly is that true?
Number 1. The budget nobody read past the headline. The 2026-27 federal budget arrived under a banner Treasurer Jim Chalmers and the Albanese government were eager to repeat: care and opportunity. At $833.2 billion in total expenditure, it was framed as the largest social investment package in years, complete with headline figures for aged care, hospitals, and Medicare that dominated the press conference soundbites. Ministers stood behind podiums promising a stronger care system for all Australians, and for a news cycle, that framing held. But buried deep inside the budget papers, far from the opening remarks, sat a very different number: a projected $37.8 billion reduction in NDIS expenditure growth over the next 4 years. This wasn't a line item anyone highlighted on stage. It surfaced instead in actuarial tables and structural reform documents, the kind of pages most Australians never open. When journalists and disability advocates pressed for clarity, the government's response was carefully worded. Health Minister Mark Butler insisted this is not a cut, pointing out that NDIS payments would still grow year on year, just far more slowly than previously projected. Technically true, but for the roughly 160,000 participants set to be removed from the scheme entirely under new eligibility rules, that distinction offers little comfort. Disability advocate Jared Sandel-High, who relies on the NDIS to manage cerebral palsy, called the announcement a dark day, saying the community had been blindsided by the scale of what was coming. This is the first fracture point in the budget's narrative, an official language of sustainability and growth moderation, sitting directly on top of a lived reality where people are losing access to support they depend on. The gap between the press release and the actuary spreadsheet is where this investigation begins.
Number 2. $60,000, $31,000, $26,000. Behind every percentage point in a budget document is a real person's weekly schedule, and nowhere is that clearer than in the NDIS plan cuts. Under the new reforms, the average annual spend on individual participant plans is being pulled down from $31,000 to $26,000, a reduction of roughly $5,000 per person per year. That's not a modest trim, it's a return to 2023 funding levels, imposed in 2026 after 3 years of rising inflation, higher wages for support workers, and increased costs for therapy, transport, and equipment. In real terms, the purchasing power of that plan has fallen even further than the headline number suggests. To understand what this means outside of a spreadsheet, consider a composite case built from patterns advocacy groups have described. A participant who previously used part of their plan for twice-weekly physiotherapy, a support worker to assist with grocery runs, and transport funding to attend a part-time job or community program. A $5,000 shortfall doesn't get absorbed painlessly. It forces a choice. Maybe physiotherapy drops to once a week. Maybe the community program becomes financially out of reach. Maybe a family member, unpaid and already stretched, steps in to cover the transport gap. None of this shows up in an actuarial table measuring expenditure growth moderation. What shows up there is a percentage, a trend line, a projection that reads as fiscal responsibility. What doesn't show up is the physiotherapy session that gets canceled or the job that becomes harder to keep. This is the mechanism by which a national budget conversation about billions of dollars quietly becomes a personal conversation about which supports a single person can no longer afford to keep.
Number 3. Redefining disability on paper. At the center of the NDIS overhaul sits a quiet but consequential shift. Eligibility is moving away from diagnosis and toward what the government calls functional capacity. Under the current system, a diagnosis of level 2 or 3 autism grants automatic entry into the scheme. Under the new framework, access instead depends on an assessment of how much a condition limits someone's day-to-day functioning, a standard that is inherently more subjective, more contestable, and slower to satisfy than a clinical diagnosis. This matters enormously because of who it targets. Autism diagnoses account for nearly 4 in 5 new NDIS entrants and roughly half of all current participants. A redefinition of eligibility criteria aimed broadly at functional capacity lands, in practice, overwhelmingly on one community. The government's own target makes the intent hard to dismiss as incidental. A planned reduction in total participants from over 900,000 projected to around 600,000 by the end of the decade. That is not a rounding adjustment. It is a structural target built directly into the reform's design. This raises an uncomfortable incentive question. A smaller pool of eligible participants produces a smaller, more sustainable budget line, regardless of whether underlying need in the community has actually decreased. Disability doesn't shrink because assessment criteria tighten. The paperwork simply stops recognizing it. Advocacy organizations have been blunt about what they see happening here, calling for a transparent, co-designed process that, as of now, does not exist in the reform's rollout. The question this leaves hanging is not abstract. Is this a genuine effort to direct support toward highest need, or is it rationing, engineered through redefinition, that arrives wearing the language of reform?
Number 4. Foundational supports, the system that doesn't exist yet. To justify tightening NDIS eligibility, the government points to a safety net meant to catch anyone who falls out. Foundational supports, a $3 billion program funded over 5 years and matched by state and territory governments. On paper, it sounds like a responsible transition plan, a bridge built before the old bridge is dismantled. The reality, when examined closely, tells a different story. Cuts to NDIS participation supports are scheduled to begin as early as October 2026, but the foundational support system meant to absorb the people affected is not yet designed, not yet funded in practice, and not yet operational anywhere in the country. Advocacy organizations have been explicit about what this timeline gap actually produces. It doesn't save money, it relocates the cost, shifting it onto individuals, families, and unpaid carers who absorb the burden the state was supposed to carry. The Canberra example makes the scale of the shortfall difficult to ignore. Budget documents confirm the Commonwealth's entire annual contribution to foundational supports for the Australian Capital Territory amounts to just $5.2 million a year, funding meant to stand in for an entire jurisdiction's alternative disability support system. No funding flows at all in the current transitional year, meaning the replacement infrastructure has, by the government's own figures, not yet begun. Acting policy leads at disability organizations have described this plainly. These are the supports that help someone leave the house, get to a job, stay connected to community, and remain safe. Removing that support before its replacement exists doesn't reduce demand. It simply removes the mechanism by which that demand was being met and leaves the people affected to find another way, alone.
Number 5. The hospital funding illusion. If there is one figure the government wants Australians to remember from this budget, it's $220.3 billion, the headline total for public hospital funding under the renewed National Health Reform Agreement running through 2031, alongside $25 billion in additional investment described as 3 times more than the previous 5-year agreement. Presented this way, It sounds like the most generous hospital commitment in the country's history, and in raw dollar terms, it is the largest figure ever attached to the agreement. But raw totals over a 5-year horizon can obscure more than they reveal. The Australian Medical Association has pushed back on the celebratory framing, pointing to an ongoing public hospital system it characterizes as underfunded by billions relative to actual demand, even as this new package rolls out. The gap between these two claims comes down to how the numbers are measured. A headline total spread across 5 years, multiple states, and a growing population looks very different once adjusted for inflation and expressed on a per capita basis. Funding that appears record-breaking in nominal dollars can still fall short of matching the pace at which hospital demand, wage costs, and treatment complexity are rising. This is not a hypothetical accounting dispute. It shows up directly in emergency departments running over capacity and elective surgery waitlists that continue to stretch longer in state after state, the practical, visible symptoms of a funding formula that hasn't kept pace with what hospitals actually need to operate. The government's press conference offers one number. The AMA's assessment and the queues in emergency waiting rooms offer another. Both can be technically accurate at the same time, which is precisely what makes this such a difficult story to tell in a single headline.
Number 6. Same week, different headline. News cycles rarely align this cleanly. In the same stretch of 2026 that Australians were absorbing details of NDIS eligibility changes, shrinking individual plans, and a hospital system the AMA says remains underfunded, a second headline was making its way through the business pages. The Australian Financial Review's annual Rich List had landed, and the number attached to it was $707.25 billion, the combined wealth of the country's 200 richest individuals, the highest total ever recorded in the list's 44-year history. Gina Rinehart topped the ranking for a 7th consecutive year at $39.01 billion. Harry Triguboff followed at $32.29 billion. Anthony Pratt and family sat third at $25.19 billion. These weren't modest gains distributed thinly across a large group. They were concentrated increases at the very top of an already concentrated list, one where 178 of the 200 entrants now qualify as billionaires, up from 161 the year before. Look closer at the pace of that growth, and the comparison becomes harder to ignore. The 200 richest Australians added $39 billion in combined wealth over a single year. The NDIS reforms are projected to reduce scheme expenditure growth by $37.8 billion over 4 years. One number describes 12 months, the other describes 48. Both numbers are real, both are drawn from official reporting, and both appeared in Australian headlines within weeks of each other. No further interpretation is required to notice what sits side by side here. A scheme serving disabled Australians finding 48 months to save less than what 200 individuals gained in wealth over 12.
Number 7. Almost everyone on the list is a billionaire now. There's a threshold worth pausing on. To make this year's Rich List at all, an individual needed an estimated fortune of at least $853 million, itself $106 million higher than the entry point in 2025. Once that bar is cleared, the list reveals something historic. Of the 200 people ranked, 178 are billionaires, up from 161 just a year earlier, meaning close to 9 in 10 entrants now sit above the billion-dollar mark. This isn't a gradual drift, it's a sharp structural shift in how concentrated wealth has become at the top of Australian society. The names driving this surge span familiar and newly emerging industries. Mining remains dominant, with Gina Rinehart, Ivan Glassenberg, Clive Palmer, and the Forrest family all appearing in the top 10. Property developer Harry Triguboff continues climbing, while a newer force has entered the mix, artificial intelligence and data center founders, joining the list for the first time as an entire wealth category, alongside established tech figures like Canva's Melanie Perkins and Cliff Obrecht. Perhaps most telling is where this wealth sits once ranked. The top 10 individuals alone control roughly 31% of the entire list's $707 billion total.
meaning a handful of families hold nearly a third of all wealth generated by the country's 200 richest people combined. This concentration complicates a phrase repeated throughout the same budget cycle that delivered NDIS and hospital funding constraints, that Australia is navigating a structural deficit requiring discipline and sacrifice. That claim may hold at a national fiscal level, but concentration data like this makes clear it does not apply evenly. Some balance sheets are tightening, others, quite visibly, are not.
Number 8. $50,000 a minute. Oxfam Australia took the Rich List data and translated it into a figure designed to be almost impossible to sit comfortably with. Australian billionaires' collective wealth grew by approximately $50,000 every single minute over the past year, a pace equating to a $25.67 billion increase in total, pushing billionaire wealth in the country past $686 billion. Expressed as a per-minute figure, the abstraction of billions becomes something closer to visceral, a number ticking upward continuously while ordinary budget conversations play out in the background. Oxfam didn't stop at the raw figure. They ran comparisons to show what that single year of growth could have accomplished elsewhere. According to their analysis, the increase alone could have lifted close to 1 million Australians out of poverty, or covered household electricity bills for every single household in the country for more than a year, or funded the nation's entire foreign aid budget nearly 5 times over. These are projections requiring new revenue streams or economic growth assumptions. This is money that already exists, already accumulated, sitting in the same fiscal year that produced NDIS eligibility cuts and hospital funding disputes. That reframes the entire conversation. This was never really a story about scarcity. It's a story about direction, about where enormous, real, already existing wealth is permitted to flow versus where budget documents insist there isn't enough to go around. This is precisely why calls for a tax on extreme wealth resurface every single budget cycle, echoed again this year by anti-poverty advocates pushing for structural reform to concessions benefiting the wealthiest Australians. And it's precisely why, cycle after cycle, those calls tend to make headlines, generate debate, and then quietly fail to translate into legislation.
Number 9. Who benefits from the story being complicated? Language does real work in a budget document, and it's worth pausing on the specific vocabulary chosen throughout this reform. Not cuts, but growth reduction. Not denied support, but actuarial projections relative to updated forecasts. Not fewer people covered, but sustainability reform to restore original scheme intent. Each phrase is technically defensible. Each phrase also makes it considerably harder for an ordinary Australian reading a headline to understand, in plain terms, that support is being reduced for real people. This isn't incidental. Vague, technical framing consistently generates less political backlash than a direct admission would. We are reducing NDIS growth projections by $37.8 billion over 4 years relative to actuarial forecasts. Reads as responsible fiscal management. We are cutting support for 160,000 disabled Australians. Reads as a crisis. Both sentences describe the same policy. Only one of them is likely to trend as a scandal. What makes this moment particularly striking is that even members of the billionaire class have publicly acknowledged the optics problem elsewhere in this same budget. Mining magnate Clive Palmer criticized a separate cost of living payment intended for older Australians, pointing out bluntly that a flat payment reaching people in his financial position made little sense as targeted relief, and pledging to redirect his to charity. Logistics billionaire Lindsay Fox echoed the sentiment, questioning whether he should be eligible for support at all given his wealth. If wealthy Australians themselves can recognize when a policy's framing doesn't match its real-world logic, the question worth sitting with is why that same scrutiny is so rarely applied to the language used around disability and hospital funding. Dense, technical budget documents aren't accidental. Clarity has a cost,
and someone always benefits from its absence.
Number 10. The bill comes due for someone. None of this unfolds in isolation. While NDIS plans shrink and hospitals absorb demand they say they can't fully fund, Australia's housing and rental crisis continues to intensify in parallel. Rental stress has climbed to a record 29.5%, and for households in the bottom 30% of incomes, only 2% of rental listings are considered affordable. A quarter of Rich List entrants built their fortunes in property, in the very market driving that affordability crisis. This isn't a coincidence sitting beside the other threads in this investigation. It's the same thread. Disability support shrinking, hospital funding stretched thinner than headlines suggest, housing costs climbing beyond reach, and running directly alongside all three, wealth concentrating at a pace and scale unmatched in the Rich List's 44-year history. Individually, each of these stories can be explained away with technical language, actuarial projections, 5-year funding horizons. Placed together, they describe one economy operating on two very different sets of rules. Before this investigation closes, there's a genuine challenge worth issuing. Every state and territory now has its own foundational supports rollout timeline, its own hospital funding allocation under the National Health Reform Agreement, its own version of these numbers playing out locally. Those figures are published in budget papers, state health department releases, and disability commissioner reports, sitting in plain public view for anyone willing to look. This story doesn't end with one video. It ends, if it ends at all, with enough people tracking these numbers in their own communities that vague language stops being sufficient cover. Not outrage, scrutiny. That's the only tool that consistently keeps a budget honest. If this investigation showed you something the headlines conveniently left out, that's exactly why this channel exists. So hit subscribe and ring the bell, because the next budget cycle is already being written, and someone needs to be watching. Drop a comment with the number that hit you hardest. Was it the $50,000 a minute or the $5,000 taken from someone's weekly plan? And if you think one more person in your life needs to see where this money is actually going, share this now, because the paper trail only stays hidden if we stop following it.